Today, I'm really pleased to bring you a discussion with Kevin Nye, the author of Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness. He wrote the book a few years ago, and I read it about a year ago, and I've been increasingly interested in what can be done about the problem of homelessness. A lot of the things that I grew up believing about homelessness have been proven false, and more importantly, a lot of the things that I grew up believing about the people experiencing homelessness were also proven false. So when I crossed paths with Kevin on social media, he seemed like a person that was really worth having a conversation with. So I'm Brandon, and this is the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political stances, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and the nation. So I think that's enough of an introduction. Let's get directly to the interviewer. Well, good evening, Kevin. It's great to finally get a chance to talk to you in person.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the reason that I wanted to talk to you is because you wrote a book a couple years ago named Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness. And I read that probably about a year ago. Just to give you a little bit of my backstory, I grew up very conservative, very evangelical. And then in 2020 through 2021, I experienced some things in my life that made me start questioning a lot of those assumptions about the nature of my faith and my politics. And one of the things that I got involved with in late 2021 or so was our local homeless shelter, where I've been helping to lead worship on a periodic basis and also serving food and doing various other things for them. And it really got me thinking about the nature of what we do there. As I started meeting the people, it started changing my heart and my heart for them and my heart for the ministry. And I started realizing that some of the things that this particular homeless shelter was doing, I'd say they seemed a little bit troublesome to me. And for example, forcing the residents to attend worship services every Sunday, making it more about getting them saved in some sense than just purely serving them. And so when I read your book, it really caught my attention, particularly because of the housing first model. And I'd basically been unaware of that until I listened to a podcast about the same time I read your book that talked about why that's so important. And so I thought it would be really good to talk to you, partly because I do have some people in my local area that watch these podcasts. I'd love to get them more involved, but understanding the how and the why of really ministering like that, I thought would be really helpful. And so, I hope this brings attention to your book, but I also want to bring attention to the problems and the best ways to meet these needs. So I thought we should start with why don't you introduce yourself first, and then I want to start with some shared language and getting a sense of the terminology that we ought to be using. So tell me a little bit about yourself, why you read the book or wrote the book, and a little bit of your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I also grew up pretty conservative, evangelical, and I sort of had a lot of folks call it like deconstruction, right? Period. When I went to college, actually, and had the opportunity to study theology. I felt a call to ministry at a young age, so I went to my denomination's school to study theology and ministry, and kind of against all odds at this pretty conservative, denominational school. I just got exposed to a lot of really interesting and great theology that really convinced me that that the heart of God beats for the poor, the stranger, the outcast, the vulnerable. And so I kind of carried that with me into seminary. I went to Fuller Seminary, which I guess depending on how conservative or liberal you are, is either too conservative or too liberal, but it's somewhere kind of right there in the middle. And I just kind of continued my exposure to more theologies and more modes of thinking. And uh, by the time that I was graduating seminary, I felt kind of strongly that um, I wasn't being called at that moment to, take a church, as it were. Um, and so I started working at a drop-in center for people experiencing homelessness. And it was shortly after that that the denomination I grew up in sort of called me in, and we had our annual conversation about how things were going on my track to ordination, and the conversation kind of went sideways, and
Hmm.
we ended up having to part ways over just some theological disagreements. Uh, and that kind of confirmed for me that this vocation I had started taking on um, in the realm of homelessness was going to be long term. Um, and so, if folks don't know where Fuller is, it's in Pasadena, which is essentially Los Angeles.
Okay.
And so that's where I was doing this work, was in Los Angeles, and I did it for about 5 years before I sort of thought, I want to kind of bring these two worlds together, of my faith background, my theological training, and also this work that I'm doing um, in community with people who experience homelessness. So that's where the kind of idea for the book came from and came out of, and uh, kind of just catapulted from there into this thing I kind of get to do now, where I get to come on podcasts and talk about homelessness, and I get to talk to churches about homelessness, and I do um, decent amount of traveling and speaking and writing at that intersection, while also I still kind of I keep my day job where I work directly in this field, but I've since moved to Minneapolis, so that's where I'm at right now.
Oh, okay. And that day job is what do you do on a daily basis? Just ballpark.
Yep. So these days, I'm a housing director for a nonprofit that focuses on youth homelessness, so 18 to 24-year-olds primarily. My job is to oversee all of our housing programs. So that's two buildings that are solely dedicated to young people coming out of homelessness, uh, for a total of over 90 units, and then a bunch of programs that work to house folks just throughout the city in random apartments, and provide those services directly to them.
And is that a city sponsored program? It's not a private program?
It's a nonprofit. Um,
Okay.
the we get some county funding and things like that, but it's not a I don't work for the county or the city or the government.
Okay. So let's start, like I said, with establishing some shared languages here, because one of the first things I learned when actually starting to look into homeless ministry was that the word homeless was probably abused a little bit and disfavored among people who are advocates for them. So, what's the useful and descriptive terminology as opposed to the politically correct language? Homelessness, homeless person, unhoused person.
Yeah, I sort of I have my own way of going about this, where I like to emphasize that I will always explain what language I use, um, but I don't like to police other people's language.
Okay, that's fair. That's good.
And part of the reason for that, honestly, is that the people who I most often hear saying homeless or homeless people uh, is homeless people, right?
Okay.
And so it's sort of like advocates who taught me other ways of saying it, um, such as people experiencing homelessness, right? That's
Mhm.
person first language, so that we understand that they are first a person, right? And that homelessness is something that they are experiencing, but is something that um, can and should be temporary, that doesn't define who they are, that it's not an attribute about them like their hair color, right? That's intrinsic. Um, and then I also was taught to use the phrase unhoused instead of homeless, right? Which I like that one, because it sort of it breaks our brain a little bit, because we've spent our whole lives hearing the word homeless, and so we ascribe all of these things to it, that are stereotypes or images that we conjure up. And when we say unhoused, it sort of uh, I feel like we don't bring all that baggage to it, and it also sort of puts the emphasis on housing, right? That these are
Okay.
people who are not housed, um, and sort of I think reminds us that um, housing and having enough housing for people is a community responsibility, and not the responsibility of an individual, right? Because if you say a person is homeless, right, that's sort of like there's something wrong with them that they don't have a home versus they are unhoused. I think sort of etymologically says there's something wrong with us that we've allowed them to not have access to housing.
Okay.
And so
That
so
makes a
those
lot
are
of
the
sense.
yeah. So those are the terms that I use and why I use them. But again, I never call anyone out for using other language, because I just don't think that that's my place.
Okay. No, that really makes a lot of sense. And I think, to me at least, the word home conveys a sense of ownership, of belonging in a space as opposed to just occupying a space.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in some way, saying someone who's unhoused, I hate to say it, it almost feels like it's a little bit detrimental to the discussion in that sense, because, I mean, I think we want to communicate the idea that people deserve a home, but I can certainly see the value behind person first language. So there's a lot of tension in that, isn't there?
Yeah, and I would say I definitely agree with you, and I'm very often kind of playing with these ideas of what is a house, what is a home, how do we understand homelessness with it. But I will say that you can have a actually no, I wouldn't say that. Let me try again. Um, it is extremely important to recognize that homelessness is primarily a problem of housing, right?
Okay.
And I would argue that as communities, we have a responsibility to make sure that there is enough adequate and affordable housing for people. And when we don't, that creates the reality of people not having a place to live. Uh, home home requires a lot more than
Yes.
that, right? But I don't know that we can get to the home part if we don't get the house part first.
That makes
What
a
I,
lot of
what
sense.
what I almost said is that you can't have home without a house, and I don't want to say that because I think that a lot of people who experience homelessness, quote unquote, um, make home wherever they are, um,
Sure. Okay.
and 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 I think that we do a disservice when we don't recognize that and value it. Um, and also, they still deserve housing, right?
Sure.
Um, and we also certainly do the opposite too, where um, we will move someone into housing that is inadequate, that is really far away from resources, that is um, dilapidated, and think that we've done our job,
Help them.
right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I love that. That makes a lot of sense. And that's something that I certainly think will stick with me. Um, One of the things that came to mind while you were talking was this video that I watched about the situation in Finland, I believe it was, where they've taken the very strong housing first model, and their number of unhoused people has sharply dropped and continues to drop since they did so. They say they've ended it there. I think it's probably overstating the matter, but they had several interviews with people who were living in these um, facilities that they've built, and they actually do make it a home because, and one of the things they pointed out is that it's very important to give them a place that is truly their own, because then they can do things like hang pictures of their children on the wall, you know, show their artwork of things that they've done, and that gives them a much greater sense of presence and self than simply sticking them in a bed or a cot in a group situation. And
Yeah. It gives
certainly
all
when
of us
someone's
that, right?
sure, yeah. And for them, it's
Yeah.
a strong incentive to do what's necessary to stay in that situation as opposed to getting kicked back out again for poor behavior or, drug abuse or something. So I guess the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is that along those lines, there's a lot of people that I've been interacting with seem to have some level of delusion that's apparent once you get to know them. The first guy that I actually started to try and be friends with, I invited him out to lunch. I met with him several times, and I started to realize the stories that he was telling me were obviously not possible because they changed every time. And there were, like, the one time he said, "Oh yeah, I got shot in the back of the head. There's bullet wound right there, and it didn't kill me." And then he told me a story about some other equally kind of crazy thing. And after about the fourth or fifth story, I started realizing he really does believe what he's saying, but I can't believe any of it myself. But it seemed to me to be more common than I would have expected when I was interacting with the people in these shelters. I could pick up hints of that. How common do you think that is among the people who are unhoused?
Well, statistically, because we study this, right?
Okay.
And what we see, kind of broadly, is that around, at most 30 to 40, maybe 45% of people who experience homelessness, suffer um, some sort of mental health condition, right? And those
That's a
can
lot.
range. Yeah, it is. It's definitely bigger than the general population, right? But it is also important that we sort of understand how that relationship works, right? Because very often homelessness gets blamed on mental illness, right? Like, um, a number of very well-meaning uh, folks will say that the reason that homelessness is so bad is because our mental health system is terrible, and our mental health system is terrible, and it does lead to homelessness in many cases. But we also have to understand that homelessness is a reality that worsens and can even generate mental health crises, right? Um, so I'm pretty public about this, that I suffer from anxiety and depression. Um, I It doesn't stop me from being able to go to work, love my family, sleep for the most part, and have a pretty typical life, right? Um,
But if you were unhoused, it would obviously exacerbate that significantly, especially in the
exactly
absence
right.
of medical care.
Yes, exactly. I there's a medicine that I take that helps me with that. I have certain coping mechanisms that I go to. I have certain people in my life that I turn to during, like, worst seasons of that. Um, and absent those things, added on the complete lack of feeling safe when you're experiencing homelessness, the constant survival mode of wondering where's my next
Yeah.
meal going to come from, right? Um, the things that can do to a human brain, right? To a human psyche, to a human soul, um, is where I think we see the most, um, I guess, acute and obvious um, examples of this among people
Okay.
experiencing homelessness. I think where another aspect too is that it's very often exaggerated, for folks who engage with homelessness primarily by who they see on street corners or even in shelter
Okay.
settings, right? Because so much of homelessness is unseen, right? It's people who are sleeping
Yeah.
in cars, people who are doubled up, families who are in kind of long term interim situations, right? And so the folks who are the most visible to us usually are the folks who have fallen through all of those other cracks and are the ones who are therefore having most of their symptoms in public in front of everyone.
Yeah. I work in an engineering profession, and one of the things that we have to be the most careful of is making sure that our data is representative.
Mhm.
So it makes a lot of sense. What fraction would you say, and this just goes to, I suppose, a conservative talking point, what fraction of people do you think are there by their own choice, by, you know, choosing not to engage with work or choosing not to spend their money in the right way?
Yeah, so I'm not I'm gonna say zero,
Okay.
and I'm gonna defend it in
Okay.
this way, right? Because I don't think that anybody chooses to experience homelessness in the sense that um, I've never met anyone that would rather um, sleep outside every day in a tent than have a safe, warm place to sleep every night, right?
Okay.
Now, it's how we attain those things or who or how we've decided that those resources are allocated where the rub is, right? Now,
Okay.
I think that there are people in my life who are housed who are sort of intrinsically more um, they like working more than others.
Hmm.
They prefer like you know a hard day's labor versus other folks I know are more artistic. Um, I think I think ultimately where the idea that there are so many people experiencing homelessness who just don't want to work. I would suggest that the way that we have ordered society that requires people to work in very specific ways and
Yeah.
for 40 hours a week and still barely scrape by um, is a system that some people are just that an increasing number of uh, people in our country are just not able to participate in the
Yeah.
way that is required to afford to live. Um, and I think that there are some people who spend their whole life fighting on the edge of that, right? The sort of working poor. Um, and there are others who try to do that and just can't. And there are others who see that and just opt out of it, right? Um, and by that I mean they recognize that the game is rigged against
Yeah.
them and that they could work really, really hard and still not have what they need. And so they just choose to make a different kind of life. Um,
Yeah.
and that those folks, when were they given an opportunity that they could participate in that met their needs and also gave them meaningful work to do in the sense of purpose, tasks, um, that they would absolutely do that, right? And
What you're saying makes a lot of sense. I've got a number of neurodivergent family members, and the idea for them of sitting in one place 8 hours a day, doing exactly the same thing 40 hours a week, you know, difficult at best.
yep,
Others physically limited from doing those things. So it all makes a lot of sense. So if I do the math on what you've said so far, that means that there's probably 60 to 70% of the people who are experiencing housing failure who are good, diligent people that are probably just overwhelmed by circumstances of one kind or another.
I mean, I would say that they're all good people. Well, I mean,
Okay, yeah.
I guess
Good in
how
the
you define that,
conservative,
right? Like,
societal sense of you're not a productive member, therefore you're not good. But
yeah,
they're basic, decent, average humans who just cannot make things work for some reason.
yeah. I guess I think I just struggle with the definitions there, right?
Okay,
Because I think the more time I spend around people who experience homelessness, like I feel like I see humanity much more plainly, right?
okay, yeah,
And so I think this framework where I think it really challenges the framework of what like a good normal
normal, yeah,
citizen is and should be um, and and I think quite honestly that like the system that we have um, is not set up for everyone to successfully participate in it, right?
yeah,
Um, and so therefore, those who get left out of that, we it's very easy and typical to blame them for it rather than to say that we don't have a system where everyone can be successful, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I I always am resistant to ways of categorizing um, people who experience homelessness into like these are this type and these are this type.
Okay.
Even though like obviously some experience this, some experience that. Um, I never want to do it in any way that creates a hierarchy, right? Because
Sure. Okay.
like certainly there are those who can work a traditional job, and the reason that they're not is because stroke of bad luck, medical debt, etc. Others who have a disabling condition, and so they can't work a traditional job, and the disability that comes every month isn't enough.
Hmm.
Other folks who have a severe mental illness that not only prevents them from being able to work, it prevents them from uh, participating in the social and communal aspects of society in the ways that we've structured it. Um, People who are struggling with substance use disorder, who because of that uh, have a lot of the same difficulties that people who are experiencing mental illness struggle with,
Yeah.
right? Um, and we could talk about those as categories, but I'm always going to resist the sense of like um, dividing them in a way that says like this group is more normal or this group is better or ultimately
Yeah.
more deserving, right?
So yeah, and thinking about my upbringing and the principles I inherited, because I can't say that my parents or my teachers ever taught me to think this way, but I think it was implicit in what I was surrounded by. Conservatives particularly seem to insist that it's their fault that they can change their lives if they're diligent.
Right.
But there's a quote attributed to Dorothy Day where she said that the gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And then, of course, we know Jesus said the poor will always be with you. Just there it is. And I don't think he would segregate between poor, unhoused, um, any of those things. I think it was all part of the same system for them. So I guess, I mean, I feel like we really just need to learn to simply serve people. Full stop.
Yeah, and I would maybe even go a step further and say uh, developing solidarity with people,
Okay.
because what I've learned from working in this field as long as I have now is that um, serving. Um, I appreciate that language and where I initially got it from, and I'm guessing from the same places you got it from, right? Um, Jesus saying the greatest among you is the servant,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I think where that can get um, sort of unfortunately misguided is in a methodology that says like I am here to serve you, um, in a way that sort of reinforces I am the server, you are the servee, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Um, that doesn't release um, or even acknowledge uh, privilege and power, and actually sort of reinforces that distance, right?
Okay.
Um, and to me, true service is partnership, right? It's not
Okay.
I'm here to help you, and certainly not to save you. I'm here to uh, come alongside you.
Okay. So one of the things I think that I also inherited was the idea that it was risky to serve people who aren't doing enough for themselves, because we certainly would facilitate bad behavior, poor choices, drug abuse, alcohol abuse by simply taking away the requirement to be productive. And um, so there was certainly for me, a moral choice of, I think it's perhaps, I would have considered it in some ways unethical to simply house people
Mhm.
without putting a bunch of conditions on them and requiring, like this homeless shelter that I work at, that I serve at periodically. I don't work there, it's a volunteer. Uh,
Yeah.
Basically, requiring a certain amount of money per month and um, signing contracts for behaviors and things like that. They're they're they certainly are trying to motivate people towards productivity, but it to me feels a little bit like they're trying to avoid something which can't be controlled.
Yeah. And I don't want to say that that a housing first methodology or housing someone without preconditions means that it's a free for all either, right? Like
Okay.
I'm all the times that I've been a renter, I signed a lease, and that lease had requirements on it, right? Um,
Okay.
I could lose my lease if I in the apartment building I lived in ran screaming up and down the halls every day, right? I
Mm-hmm.
could lose my lease if I punch a hole in the wall. I could lose my lease if you know, all kinds of ways. Um, if I got in a fight with my neighbor, right? If I got in a fight with my landlord, um, those those things all apply, right? Um, and I also part of one of the most of the programs that I work with in housing, folks do have to pay a portion of rent, right? This traditional Section 8 voucher um, isn't a
Yeah.
free apartment; it's income based, right? As long as you make less than a certain amount, which qualifies you for the voucher, you pay 30% of your income toward rent. Um, so if you start to make more, you get to take home more, but also your rent goes up, right? So there are ways to have that balance, right, of care, but also developing independence and making sure that people are accountable to their neighbors and to their community. That's
Yeah.
different than what we often do with behavioral contracts, and especially in the religious type settings that you describe, where it's a form of control. It's a form
Okay.
of um, assimilation. It's a form of indoctrination in a lot of ways, like you
Yeah.
described earlier. That it comes from a place where this church really would rather convert you than house you. Um, it's just a bonus if they also house you along the way, um, and and that ends up putting a lot of people in a very vulnerable situation where they're having to sort of pray to play and um, perform
Yeah.
whatever religious ritual they need to.
I'm reminded of stories about people who paid close attention to Billy Graham's ministries over in Africa and places like that. And they realized that every crusade, it was exact same people coming back and coming to the front for salvation because they learned if they wanted a bag of food, they had to say the sinner's prayer. So it meant
Yeah,
nothing to them. They were just performing for the sake of getting what they needed. And for them, it was a legitimate need. And I have, no heartburn against the people who made that choice to survive. I don't think we tend to recognize that. And so I've actually started to consider that kind of requirement from a church doing a ministry thing as a form of spiritual abuse,
yes,
which is it's harsh, but I think it needs to be said.
I would agree, and I would say too that that you don't need to do it in order to have a spiritual component to your ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So I've historically and sort of increasingly been critical of the institution of the Gospel Rescue Mission.
Okay.
And that's sort of the institutional version of what you're describing, right? They're typically um, homeless shelters that have like strong religious requirements, usually located in the sort of very dense urban area of your historic cities, right? Um, and I wrote an article for Sojourners a couple years back, interviewing a bunch of people who had worked there, who had stayed at different rescue missions to sort of bring this stuff up. And after it published, the rescue mission near me here in the Twin Cities reached out and invited me to come for a tour. And I was
Okay.
like, okay, interesting. And the email sort of suggested, we want you to kind of see some of the stuff that we're trying. And so I went and was impressed by a lot of things. Had some feedback on some of the stuff that they were still doing that I would kind of disagree. But one of the things that really jumped out was they had made the bold move to not require chapel. The chapel was now, it was still offered nightly, but it was optional. And I asked, what is attendance like at your optional chapel? And they said that more than half of the people who stay there still go to chapel.
Hmm.
And that hit so hard for me because one of the things that bothers me most about the sort of evangelistic approach to homeless ministry is that an implicit belief is that people who experience homelessness aren't Christian.
Yeah. Well,
Right?
there's a very strong prosperity gospel component to that, where
Yep.
the reason you're in this situation, and I've heard this kind of thinking. It's never been said explicitly in these meetings, but there's an implicit sense of if you did the right things, you wouldn't be in this situation. A lot of the
Yep.
sermons have that language wrapped around them, even if they're not saying it directly. I think it's almost inescapable. And
Yeah.
so, when I choose to when I get to lead worship there, I always choose songs that basically just say, God loves you. Full stop. End of story. You know, I'm a friend of God is one of the songs that I like to use.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm a friend of God because it's just, and so, yeah, my heart has been hurt by that for some time now. You use the word grace a lot in your book, and I'm kind of interested in how that ties into all this, because certainly that has that component of undeserved favor
Yep.
in the classical definition. And so how does that fit with this whole topic?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's the bedrock, right? Um, my belief and what I think is a core Christian belief, right, is that um, we we are given what we are given by God because God chooses to give it to us, right? Not because we deserve it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or depending on your theology, a more Calvinist theology might say we aren't deserving of it. A less Calvinist theology might say God has decided that we are deserving of it. Either way, right? It's not because we ourselves earned it, and it certainly isn't reserved for those who perform better than others,
Yeah.
right? For God, and so grace is a cornerstone of whatever denomination you are believes about salvation. And yet, when it comes to poverty and homelessness and things like that, it's what you just described. It's this belief that people who are experiencing poverty or homelessness, that is a result of their poor choices. Therefore, they deserve what they get unless they prove to us otherwise, right?
So
And
toxic.
that's where the Dorothy Day quote is in response to, right?
Yeah. Okay.
That if the gospel means anything, uh, if the gospel is a gospel of grace, then this notion of these poor people deserve this and these ones don't because they are nicer, because they're said a sinner's prayer, because they're willing to work, because
Mm-hmm.
they, the list goes on, because they got sober, right? That we've thrown grace out the window, right? Because we are categorizing who deserves what, and that's not how we were treated. So why is that how we are treating one another, and especially in this very specific group of people?
Okay. I'm just thinking through what you're saying and trying to decide where I want to ask you next. The whole deserving thing, certainly sitting down at table with people that are so different than you changed my mind. I'll personalize it rather than putting it on other people. It changed my heart towards them, and it changed my mind eventually towards them, that whether or not they were deserving of anything. For the last couple of years, I've been basically a believer in universal reconciliation. The idea that they don't have to do anything to begin a relationship with God for them to find their way into the kingdom. It's a matter of how long, not if. And so this idea that, you're not doing the right thing and you're going to deserve what you get, and if you don't do the right thing, you're going to spend forever in hell, just bothers me deeply these days, because it rips grace right out of the equation. And then when you actually start interacting with people that are what you were taught to believe were some of the worst people on earth for various reasons, they're apparently undeserving because they're drug users, or they've got mental problems and they choose not to work or whatever. And then you sit down next to them at a meal and engage with them. It really started changing my mind about the meaning of communion, where instead of just having a little wafer and cracker, and a bit of grape juice, you actually are sitting down at table with people that are very different than you. And, the instructions in the epistles were like, stop segregating yourselves when you sit down at a meal together. The word, their communion, we've kind of tacked onto that, but that holy feast or that holy meal, nothing I think can possibly bring us together with people quite the same as eating with them.
Yeah.
And so that started to really change my mind about their deservingness, just by getting to know them, realizing this person has wishes and hopes and dreams and fears and anger, and they're dealing with things that, pray to God, I'll never have to deal with, in honestly a very inspiring way in many cases. It's like, yeah, they deserve way more than I ever would have thought that they did, and somehow I've written them off as not deserving those things. So, even in a human standard, deserving is just wildly inaccurate, I think, for most of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
I wanted to talk about certainly your contacts, you starting in Los Angeles, and now you're in Minneapolis. I think you said it was Minneapolis, very large cities. I live in a town with about 120, 130,000 residents over an area the size of, 40 miles north-south. And I think at our, what we call Project WARM, Wrapping Arms Around Many, it's the service that does wintertime nightly sleeping arrangements, moving from church to church.
Yep.
Typically, we see 15 patrons, clients. The shelter that I'm serving at probably has about the same number of regular attendees. By the number, I think it's like 23 people per 10,000 is the number for the United States, something like that. There ought to be a couple hundred people in this county that are experiencing homeless, if that metric applies to my town. And so it's kind of invisible, but I would say there's a few dozen visibly homeless people that we interact with on a regular basis. Does the problem not scale, or is my experience here in this town unrepresentative, or are they just so invisible? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to look sort of specifically at data for your town, but what's really interesting about this is that homelessness certainly scales, up and down, but it's also not the same in every city, right? Even proportionately. And so this is where sort of most of the theory around defining homelessness specifically as a housing problem comes from, right? Because there are cities in America that do not have the same struggles of homelessness, even proportionately, right? If you take population into account. that others do, right?
Okay.
Even this last year, when we saw the staggering number that in 2023 homelessness went up 17% across the United States, there were cities where it actually went down, and there were other
Okay.
cities where it went way up, right? So what we do understand about things like substance use, mental illness, is that by and large, those are pretty equivalent in most
Okay.
places proportionately, right? Uh, but homelessness isn't. And so you can look at a city like Detroit, right? And you can actually see a lot of poverty in Detroit. You can look at a city like Cleveland, Ohio, and you see higher rates of substance use than like most other major cities. Um, you can look at, I don't have a good example for this, but a city that for some reason has a higher per capita of folks experiencing mental illness. What you don't see in those cities is increased homelessness. Actually, in a lot of those cities, you see less homelessness,
Hmm.
which if your prevailing theory of homelessness is that it's caused by poverty or substance abuse or mental illness, your theory falls apart, right?
Yeah.
Uh, the only thing that is correlated and predictive of homelessness in a city is the cost and availability of housing.
Huh. Okay.
And so that's why actually the wealthiest cities in the country, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, New York City,
Really high
have,
rates.
yeah, they have the greatest rates of homelessness because housing is so expensive, right?
And that,
And
that may
so,
affect my area
yeah,
because we are a very affluent chunk of Maryland because we live in a Navy town with a large engineer community, and the per capita income here is quite high. The housing prices are quite high. I think the median home here is probably 350,000, which, compared to LA is nothing, but compared to central DC, well, DC is not a good example just because of the downtown, but compared to the less affluent areas, it's certainly way high. So
right.
that from what you're saying, that would increase the homelessness problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what ends up happening is kind of whatever city you're in, it's a game of musical chairs, right? And this is an analogy that comes from um, this book that's actually called Homelessness as a Housing Problem, which is really good, very data statistic heavy. Um, this idea that, so you imagine you're playing a game of musical chairs. There's 10 chairs for 10 people. Music starts, people walk around the chairs, and a chair gets taken away, right? That's how you play the game. The
Right.
music stops, everyone rushes for a seat, and one person doesn't get it. And you
Mm-hmm.
notice that that person, we'll call him Greg, has a broken foot, right? So there's one way of looking at that that says, oh, Greg didn't get a chair because he has a broken foot, right? He had a disadvantage. A nice compassionate way to look at that might be, oh, we need to come alongside Greg and help him so that he has a chance at a chair, right? um, a
But the
meaner,
obvious answer is that there's not enough chairs.
exactly, right. um, the problem is the game, right? That's how the
Yeah,
game
you've got this
works.
wrong assumption beginning the whole discussion.
Yes. And so when we look at affordable housing in this country, um, for renters who are extremely low income, which means they make around 30% or less than the area median income of their area, um, for every 100 households that meets that threshold, there are only 37 affordable and available rental units for them
Wow.
nationwide, right? So now you're playing musical chairs, except instead of taking one chair away, you take six chairs away,
Yeah,
right?
our county has closed numerous trailer parks in the last few years, partly because of this NIMBY problem. Not in my
Yep.
backyard. I don't want a housing blight next to me, and trailer parks are not surprisingly considered that. So I think we're down to just a couple of them in the areas that are closest to all the services that less affluent people really need. And
Yeah.
that's got to lead to problems.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely does, right? Because, um, and again, where we have to understand, like the world that we have created says that even in a wealthy town, you need low wage workers, right? Um, in order to have affluent businesses, right?
Sure.
Um, I'm sure
Someone's got
that,
to work at Walmart.
right, someone's got to work at Walmart, someone's got to work fast food, and we've decided that those people aren't deserving of, you know, a higher wage, yet we also depend on them for
Hmm.
our city, but we also make our cities unlivable for the people who work
Yeah.
at that wage, right? We want to have our cake and eat it and not pay for it, you know. Um, and it's at some point something has to give.
Yeah. And I was thinking about our town and realizing that a lot of the space closest to the town center, which happens to be because of the mechanics of how this town grew out of a small Navy town, they built lots of low cost Navy housing for the sailors early on. Um, as the town grew, as the city, the area grew, the suburbs, if you will. I mean, they're not that far away. They're just a couple miles in my case, but that's where the affluent people ended up. So the heart of the town is where all the services are and where most of the housing is, but that's exactly where they're trying to get rid of that low cost housing. And so that seems like an intractable problem that is only going to disenfranchise the people who really need those services further, even as the people who'd rather not have the housing, the low cost housing near them, they'd rather send it way to the south end of the county, far away from everybody else, where there's no services. And, I don't see any way around that whole thing. But I mean, one of the quotes in your book was, it was never our backyard to begin with. And
Yeah,
that really hit hard.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've I've actually I don't know if I say it this way in the book, but I've started saying it in my uh, workshops and my talks that I would actually argue that for Christians, NIMBY is a heresy, right?
Yeah,
If we believe that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, then that's not your backyard, and to say that it is, and that um, you get to decide uh, who gets to live there, who gets to live next door, and to believe that your property value is more important than other people having a place to sleep at night. Um, yeah, that doesn't sound very Christian to me at all.
no. Another quote I just wanted to highlight that caught my attention was what you wrote. If each unhoused person I meet is Christ, then not only am I called to be kind and to offer help, but I'm called in many ways to sit at their feet, to listen, to learn, and to change. Um, that says a lot also about our view of the situation, where we kind of prioritize people and rank them uh, in a way that's very unlike what God probably does.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was coming from earlier when I talked about how I've sort of moved away from serving language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and recognize something that you said at the very beginning, which was that when you started doing this work, you were changed, right?
Yeah,
And that the way to approach this work isn't that I have Christ and I'm bringing Christ to them, right?
right.
It's like very clearly through Jesus's own words, it's you're going there to meet Christ,
Sure.
and if you meet Christ and aren't transformed, that's on you. um, and I've started to say it like this because the new book that I'm working on is really kind of getting into this rescue mission stuff a lot more. That I'm sort of recognizing a key difference between uh, the two types of faith based homelessness ministries, which is um, those who, um, when they see a person experiencing homelessness, you either see Christ or you see Christ missing.
Mm. That's that's tough. That'll rattle some cages,
No, I mean, disagree.
as it should.
Yeah.
I mean, walking away from an evangelical worldview has been very hard because of how long I was in it. I think I got saved, if you want to use that evangelical language, at age 5, and I've been out of that world for about 5 years. So I was thinking that way for well over 45 years in some fashion or another. It's very hard to step away from that, but it's so freeing to begin to see people without judging them in those kinds of ways. Um, for all the people in my conservative circles who think that I've completely lost my mind for, becoming liberal and progressive, I find so much more ability to see people, I think, as God does, without the filters. And it's just not something I think I could ask anyone else to give up. It took the Holy Spirit to just smack me around a little bit, and in the gracious way that the Holy Spirit does, and kick out the props that allowed me to continue those things. So, so let's see here. I'm trying to think how best to use the few minutes I have left with you.
Sure.
So one of the things that I've started to try to work on in my own sphere is, what can I do to encourage my local government to change their thought process about these matters? Because certainly making room for low-cost housing in our county is, based on everything you've said so far, going to be one of the best things that we can do. But it's also the hardest to do, I think. I can convince people to give money or their time to serve people at the shelter. It's a lot harder to say, are you willing to just to the point you just made a couple minutes ago, are you willing to not focus on your house's value? Are you willing to set aside some of what you thought you were going to give your grandchildren in your inheritance, to see that everyone, and that goes all the way back, I think, in some sense, to the gospel things about leave the wheat on the margins of the field. Don't harvest everything that you could, so that there are people that need it and they have access to it. And that's a long way from what we grow up. So when I go to my county commissioners and the board of building supervisors, or whatever they call themselves, and I start trying to advocate for, can we do something about this from a systemic level? That's going to be a long sail. One good thing that happened here in Maryland just today, the state has been considering a slew of legislation, or basically a change to the state. Basically, it's the building, or what do they call it? The department is like the building and housing development or something like that. And they were drafting a law that would basically have shut down any shelters that didn't comply with a really, really, really long string of requirements, like how they prepare and serve food, making sure that people are certified and trained in certain ways who go volunteer at these ministries. So it would have shut down churches coming into a shelter and providing food. It would have done a lot of damage to the smaller faith-based ministries. And so I just found out today that particular law has been shelved until they figure out what to do with these, the need for these more individual, smaller service ministries, than thinking everything has to be done from a state level. Because you might serve the inner city well that way, but you're not going to serve my town, where there is no centralized housing. There are no government-based ministries. Our housing waiting list right now for the housing department is something like 7 years long.
Yeah.
So, how do we, back to asking you the question then, what could we actually realistically do at a small local level to encourage change, if not bring it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of things, and it definitely gets at a lot of what you're talking about, which is, the making room for affordable housing and especially deeply affordable housing. But I think part of the good news is that there's a lot of really meaningful things we can do before we start asking like ma and pa landlord homeowner to really sweat their home equity that much actually,
Hmm.
because when we talk about out of control rents or out of control housing prices in cities across America, what we're actually looking at is not, you know, uh, boomers buying their second house. What we're seeing is corporations, hedge funds, private equity buying up huge portions of the housing market in cities,
Hmm.
and and essentially controlling so much real estate that they can manipulate prices, right?
Okay.
Um, and if you look at apartments these days, like um, I when I say things about rental properties or landlords on social media, folks always come after me, right? Like, oh, I own I own 2 units and I'm barely covering my costs, and I have to say, like, I'm not even really talking about you. Like,
Okay.
we can make you exempt for a while from most of the things that we're talking about. What we're talking about is um, housing being treated like an investment commodity by folks who have so much money and so much stake in the game, that they're they're killing us, right? So something that Minnesota actually has batted around at the state level. Our state legislature is really weird, and it only meets in certain like sessions. So stuff gets tabled for long periods of time. But one of the ones that's been uh, kind of on the docket is a statewide ban of corporations owning single family homes.
Wow.
Um, and that would make a huge, immediate, meaningful change, right? Because if it would either prevent them from buying in the future, or if it went retroactive, like corporations would have to sell, which would open up a whole lot of homes at actual market value to
Okay.
families, um, rather than what's happening, especially out of COVID, where um, a lot of folks were leaving California and
Hmm.
going to Arizona, Nashville, uh, Minnesota, Austin, Texas, and these cities like out of nowhere saw these astronomical housing booms of people showing up, paying cash above fair market value. Um, but and a lot of people attribute that to, oh, these wealthy California people came out and bought the houses, but actually it was private equity that beat them by 3 months and snatched them all up so that
Yeah.
they could then sell them to the Californians coming out at that higher price, right? And so like legislation and regulation can go after those first before it really touches, you know,
The individual.
the individual. Like,
Yeah.
I'm now a homeowner. I'm more than happy to pay my property taxes and my fair share. I would not resist affordable housing coming into my neighborhood, even if it affected my property value. But really, like the biggest impact changes could happen before it ever touched me.
Okay. I actually own a couple rental houses that we flipped a couple years back or renovated and kept. One of them we actually lease as a Section 8. And
Mm-hmm.
that for us at the time was a huge step because, the I guess the way that people think about Section 8 houses is always bad. And if you find out that there's a Section 8 rental in your neighborhood, people get very nervous. And there was actually a couple that were built here by a bit of a sketchy builder, and people were very angry because they were considered to be dragging down the property values of the houses around them. And so I've thought about that issue a lot, but I found that two things. One, the government treats us pretty well. Those of us who can rent something to Section 8 clients. And the other is that the person that I rent it to really takes care because they do not want to lose the opportunity to stay in that house with government assistance. So I think we conservatives, when I was one, were taught a lot of things that were really unhelpful about that whole thought process. So I think sometimes maybe it's just a matter of educating people gently. So I literally didn't get to maybe half of the questions that I hope to ask you, but I do want to end with this particular one. I think we could go for another hour if I didn't want to be gracious to your time, but I used to believe it was really the church's job to fight homelessness and do other critical ministries for people rather than turning it over to the government. That was kind of a conservative talking point. Why should Uncle Sam do this when God gave them responsibility to the church? But then I started looking around and, in the last few years, realizing that the church really wasn't doing it. You look at the mega church budget, and typically I've done the research on this. For the average mega church, about 1% of their budget goes to ministry in their local area, outside their doors. 99% of their budget, of their tithe and offerings, go straight to themselves, to paying for the rent, paying for the pastor, or the building, I guess, all those things that have nothing to do with actually serving. And I think it's also instructive that, at least in America up to this point, and we could talk about politics certainly, but we the people are the government at some very real level. So it's kind of deceptive to say that the government does something that we don't as a people choose to do, instead of saying, well, it's the church's responsibility. So it seems like a big lie that a lot of people tell themselves, well, the government should not be doing this because that's what God told the church. I'd love your thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with you, that if the people that tend to say that aren't the ones doing it, right? It's just, I would always just turn it right back on them and say, okay, then do it so the government doesn't have to, right? But I would also disagree with their premise. I don't see the reason for having a government if it's not to pool our resources to take care of one another, right? We establish ourselves as governments to help make communal rules, to help build roads, to help have schools, and part of that just needs to be housing, and it's not. You could say the same thing for medical care, right?
Yeah.
So these are the two biggest areas in which we have allowed something to be a commodity that generates wealth for people, that is actually an essential for human life to flourish, right? And by doing that, we have created all the problems.
But you use the word flourish, and therefore you're a liberal, so we can't trust you.
Right. Yes, I can't write that in my grant proposal, or else it won't pass muster anymore. And so to me, like, I think this, and we could talk all day about the ironies, is that, like, that is generated out of the fear of giving a government too much power, and yet those people have voted for the current government that is seizing power right and left, right? So we can go off on a whole thing there, but we won't. I was just gonna say, I guess to me, that I don't believe that it's the church's job to end poverty. I think that is all of our jobs collectively. That makes it the government's job, and it also makes it the church's job, right? It's not one or the other.
What occurred to me when you said that is something I mentioned to my wife earlier tonight, that a lot of churches seem to participate in these kinds of ministries. I don't know if you're familiar with the word counting coup. It's an old term from Native American origin, where the warrior would show his bravery by doing something outrageous and like riding up and smacking an enemy on the back and riding away without getting hurt, or attacking a bear recklessly and killing it or something like that. And they would record like notches on their tomahawk handle or their bow or whatever, showing that this many times I've counted coup, I have done something brave. And it almost feels like a lot of what the churches participate in these days is a form of that kind of a, I'm doing good things to get a good mark on my behalf, showing how good I am, more perhaps than simply to serve one another. And so what occurred to me as you were saying what you were saying was this idea that perhaps part of the problem is that the churches want credit for things that the government's doing. So they don't want the government to do it. They want to be able to say, well, we're doing all those things and see we're better than the rest of the world because we're doing these things. It's doesn't seem very honest.
Yeah. And two quick things I'll say to that, if it's okay.
Sure.
One is you're absolutely onto something, and it's why when I criticize a church ministry, right, like a rescue mission or like the ones you've been describing, right, the pushback I often get is like they're doing their best, like they don't know any better, like why are you going after like a Christian organization that's trying to help? And it's because to them intent is more important than impact, right? And that speaks to what exactly you're saying, that the function of that ministry is not to end poverty or to end homelessness. It's to feel good. It really is. It's to feel good, to feel like you're earning Jesus points or a jewel in your crown or whatever it is, right? And therefore it doesn't have to result in a person's poverty ending or a person's homelessness ending or really overcoming any sort of communal or systemic evil, right? And it's actually kind of better if you don't, because then you might have to close down the ministry, right? And so I think that is why so many church ministries are focused on like very basic needs like overnight shelter and food, and never look upstream about why are so many people hungry? Why do so many people have no place to sleep, right? Because they're largely not interested in the injustice. They are interested in charity.
Ouch. But I think you're right. That makes a lot of sense. So did you mention you're writing a new book?
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it's about what we've been talking about here, actually.
Oh, okay.
Which I really appreciated when I saw your questions. I was like, this is great because it leads from my last book, but it's a lot of the ideas that I'm exploring more deeply, which is what does a Christian ministry or Christian nonprofit look like if it's focused on the right things, right? And so one put in contrast with negative examples that I do critique in the book, but I was very deliberate that I don't want to write a book about what's going wrong or what not to do, right? I want to write a book about what's going right and what to do. And so the smallest portion of the book is reserved for sort of critiquing this rescue mission model as a sort of main example of a lot of what we've been talking about, the prioritization of evangelism, the transactional services. But the vast majority of the book is telling stories of churches, ministries, faith-based nonprofits that are doing it right, by my estimation. And so it's been a lot of interviewing folks, a lot of compiling interviews into just stories, kind of categorizing them in chapters that are around similar topics. So it's going to be a very different book, a very different style of writing, a very different approach. but I've sort of been talking about it like my first book was like the head and the heart, that this book is the hands and the feet.
That's awesome. And what's the timeline on that?
So currently furiously writing. Um, right now it's looking to come out at the beginning of 2026.
Okay.
All
I
goes well.
really look forward to seeing that. And hopefully before then I can catch up with you again, because I think there's more things that I would like to poke at a little bit. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's really good news for you. So, and thank you again. Where can people find your current book, Grace Can Lead Us Home?
Yeah, it's anywhere books are sold, pretty much, as they say, which
Okay.
isn't actually true. Like, there's lots of places you can buy books and not find my
Sure.
book. But all of your traditional online booksellers can
Yeah.
find it. And in terms of where you can find me, I'm online a little bit less these days. But I try to focus my energy on Substack, where I write usually weekly, sometimes every other week, on the things that we've been talking about. I like to take a really deep dive into either maybe something going on in the news related to homelessness, or just whatever's been I've been thinking about or dealing with at work. Uh, and so the way to find that is kevinmnye.substack.com. It is free. I'm never going to put anything behind a paywall because I want it to be available to everyone.
Yeah.
Uh,
Appreciate that.
so you can go and subscribe to that and get my thoughts and ramblings like this in your inbox regularly.
Well, I will certainly link to that, and I will also link to the book on Amazon, which is probably the easiest way for most people to start, at least.
For sure.
And I posted a brief review after I read the book, just because I do that with all the books that I've been reading. It's just a great way for me to keep track of what I've read and have a
Yeah.
quick reference and say, well, go look there. That this is my thinking. So I very much appreciate your time tonight. You've been very generous. And like I said, I really do hope I can chat with you again sometime.
Yeah, I'm up for it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Well, as I said at the end of that conversation, I could easily have filled another hour with my questions. It's pretty clear that Kevin is well grounded in this topic, and more than just knowing about homelessness, he clearly knows how the church usually relates to the topic. And a lot of the things that he has to say are difficult to hear. But I think they're critical to hear if we're going to love people like Jesus did, in a very practical sense. Jesus often was referring to embodied issues when he used the words that we translate salvation or saved. It wasn't just spiritual or eternal matters to Jesus. And I think it would really do us well to carry that forward into our world today. How can we bring here and now salvation to people, not just how do we get them to heaven someday? As always, thanks so much for spending some time with me today. Please like and subscribe if you found this useful, and share it with people you think might benefit. And I'd love to chat with you about this if you have any questions or comments. So be blessed, and we'll talk again soon.